Hello, and welcome to Barn Blog. And today on Radical Engagements here at Barn Blog, we are talking about Mark Fisher's July of 2015, now almost a decade old, article on K-Punk, Democracy is Joy. His categories for this old blog were capitalist realism, communist realism, and post-capitalist desire. But this was in this period after he wrote The Vampire Castle, where he started pivoting more and more to labor as a point of departure from the Blairite past. And we can talk about the popularity of Corbyn or the possibility of Corbynism. One thing is very clear, though, that Keir Starmer's position in labor today is that of a placeholder. It is like Blair without even Miliband's personality of lukewarm spit. I follow British politics and have since I was in my late teens. But I also find it today the irony of democracy is joy when we were talking about the joy of the Harris campaign merely 2 months ago. And now I literally can't imagine anything more painful than having to hear one more thing about this goddamn election. Now, this will be released way after this election is settled in November. I tend to release these things about 2 months out. But I wanted to talk about this because this was, along with the Vampire Castle piece, I think a real sign of departures in Fisher's thought. And they were an attempt to grapple for hope. And I don't think that hope went well. Now, I'm not here to psychoanalyze or play psychologist to a dead comrade. I liked Fisher. We exchanged letters. I published the Vampire Castle piece. All this is well known, and maybe I've talked too much about it. I worked for one of Fisher's publications, but I never worked under him. He had left by the time I was there. And I've gone through all this stuff before. But going back and getting back into this headspace, but what happened in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, even bracketing out the personal tragedy of the death of Mark, this is something we have to deal with because it seems to have gone in directions that didn't end up playing itself out the way that a lot of these Gen Xers who are leading these millennial leftists would have hoped. So let us transfer back to a different time when blogging was beginning to ramp down before we got into the newsletter model of blogging, which just monetizes something that already exists. When we were all beginning to feel hope for Corbyn and Sanders and Podemos and Syriza, and all these predictions were being made by leftists, be they MMT or wonks or Marxist, that have mostly ended up being, as political predictions, utterly wrong, that we have punished very few people for making. And I want to talk about maybe why we were in this. Now, I was never as sanguine about these insider-outsider strategies as Fisher was, ever. I was not on the Bernie Twain in 2016. I wasn't even in the country at the time. And I only got on the Bernie Twain in 2020 extremely reluctantly and cynically. But with trying to deal with the fact that I missed and didn't understand the spirit of what was going on in 2016 because I was in Egypt at the time. So I want to go into this piece. Yeah, this even looks like a different age. Democracy is joy. And my immediate response is, no, it fucking isn't. Democracy is war. The meaning of we should fight for is a belief in politics itself. is belief that we can throw off the demands of supposedly impartial economy that serves only the few, that we can reject the fallacy that the economic necessity demands something we consider socially unacceptable, and instead begin to make decisions about our collective social life. It is precisely this that makes the Greek oxy vote inspiring, the potential for return of politics, and the headaches and uncertainties of attempting to walk into the unknown path. Bert Russell. Now, we all know how that Greece thing went, too, with Syriza and Oxy. Nothing lasts forever, of that I'm sure. It's somewhat ironic that the theories of the event, and this is, I guess, referring to Badiou and Deleuze here, who are operating off of the Heideggerian term of the event, although Badiou is really doing something completely different with it, have come to the fore in the most fashionable areas of academic political philosophy at just the moment in history when it has become clear that events in and of themselves don't change anything. I don't know why it wasn't clear in the 1968 that events didn't change anything. It was very clear in America that they didn't. Although perhaps there was still enough going on in the developing world with national liberation movements and decolonial movements where it did feel like specific events mattered. We hadn't seen a lot of these states in the 60s and 70s be forced to capitulate to neoliberal economic orders or the IMF. We have definitely seen that now. After all, how many African countries are still paying France for shit? All right. From the G20 protests, excuse me, I was thinking about the G8 protests because I participated in them when I was 18, to millions marching against the Iraq war, I did that too, to the Arab Spring, I saw the counter-revolution against that, to the short-lived student campaign against fees in the UK, I don't know anything about that except that it happened. The narrative of eventual politics since the late 1990s has been relatively repetitious. Honestly, it's been relatively repetitious since the late 1960s, but okay. I still see where he's coming from. But the time you get to the aughts and aught-teens, it's undeniable, where there's still plausible deniability that this stuff matters around the new left and the new communist movement. Euphoric outbursts of dissent are followed by depressive collapse. Fuck, we've lived through several of these. See 2020 to 2022. Eventualism is the manic flimp side of the general depressive tendency and boring academic Marxism, in which an ostensible Leninism, Maoism, everything will change after the revolution, obfuscates a de facto Adornianism, nothing can ever happen, everything is bad, so we might as well keep on taking the state's paychecks. I mean, Adornism is both, in some ways, more honest and more destructive. It's interpolative almost. I've read and responded to Adorno's essay Resignation before. The whole rehabilitation of the status of philosophy itself in the past couple of decades, the reversal of the democratizing move to theory. I mean, was theory really democratizing? Not really. And the colonization of what is now called theory by third-rate obscurance philosophy and curated babblespeak, which is funny for a guy who worked with the CCRU. I mean, but anyway, Fisher himself was not guilty of it, but he was definitely guilty of working with people who definitely did that. Is a sideshow, of course, but a symptomatic one. The sour comedy of academic philosophical Leninism and Maoism can now be seen as one of the last acts in the postmodern shadow play. Now, it's interesting that people focus on his critique of identity politics in The Vampire Castle and miss that he also attacked Maoist, Leninist, and ultra-leftist for saying that things like Russell Brand's Democratic Revolution would never be good enough. I mean, people forget that part of the essay. They also forget the part about Russell Brand because it was inconvenient even 2 years after it was written, much less now. Nonetheless, a pantomime in which we are condemned to the role of an interactive audience, tweeting our responses onto screens behind the main players who carry on regardless. Well, very little has changed. The emergence of Podemos and Syriza, Oh, you poor summer debt child, Mark. The post-referendum SNP, Scottish National Party, and the Kurdish Women's Movement are part of another rhythm of political transformation. Yeah, almost all of whom, with maybe the exception of the Kurdish Women's Movement in Rojava, despite the fact it got geopolitically screwed by almost everyone who interacted with it, lost bad. But after achieving power, which the Sanders movement never did, and the Corbyn movement, well, got significantly closer to it, also never did. The unseemly way in which the swivel chair Marxist philosophers and anarchists have slavered over the perceived missteps by Syriza tells us all we need to know about these revolutionaries. They weren't perceived missteps, Mark. I know you're dead, and I know we disagreed about this when you were alive, but they weren't perceived missteps. They were actual missteps. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis would not be making the noble bourgeois subject tour about how he was betrayed, and he was betrayed, if they weren't missteps. They don't want any of the sort of positive change to spoil the purity of revolutionary theory. It's funny how everyone uses this purity argument to basically justify either tailism or not criticizing things. Those are the two ways that is used. And we already see it in Fisher. But what is he even employing it for? I mean, it's employed today to defend the history of the Soviet Union and the PRC, as long as you don't mention the Sino-Soviet split too loud, and point out also the divisions within the CCP in the 1960s and 70s, and pretend that was all just Westerners fighting over nothing. As long as you ignore that, but at least that's a noble historical project, right? Like, trying to understand and defend, or at least, the project of socialism, which did, even if it failed, lift millions of people out of poverty, educated tons and tons of people in the former Russian Empire, modernized a lot of the Russian infrastructure, at least to industrial levels, and did it in a very short period of time. Whether, what other barbarisms came out of that, and I'm not going to say there weren't any. I'm not that kind of apologist. I don't do hagiography, but the idea, at least that makes sense. Doing this about the possibility of a reform, that purity is a way to avoid that doesn't make sense. Because the reforms weren't that viable. And people pointing out the missteps are seen as betrayal by Fisher. Like the people today who yell at people critiquing AOC, but then make the same arguments against Biden that the people who are critiquing AOC are making. That never occurs to them. And this kind of politics really does come back into vogue here. And it was led by the British. I know we forget this because the British left has all but melted into the ether. I mean, even the publishing apparatus of the American left was largely dependent, with the exception of Haymarket, which ironically came from a British Trotskyist tradition, the independent socialist tradition that joined up with the international socialist tradition, really had very little representation in the ISO by the time it was dissolving in the early teens. For those of you who don't know, that's the International Socialist Organization, who used to own Haymarket Books, of which Haymarket was a party press initially. But the other major presses that weren't Trotskyist party presses were largely British. That's Verso, that's Zero, that's Repeater. I think that's Zed Books too. And a lot of those now are collapsing because there's not really that much market left in the British left. The revolutionary event will redeem everything when it comes, but the time is not right, not yet, never yet. Whether capital crushes Syriza or not, it did, and it did so majorly. It has already made major contributions to what will be the long struggle to overturn neoliberal hegemony. Honestly, the right made more a line from Keir's on social strikes and directional demands has kept coming back to me in all this noise and chaos around the Greek situation. And even at their point of failure, Plan B electoral politics can be useful if they can clarify the anti-democratic effects of neoliberalism that work against all forms of collective action. Tell that to people who have been so crushed by the troika in Greece that they might as well have ventured from the poverty of Grexit. Now, I was never optimistic about the productive capacity of Greece to be able to, immediately overcome its productive limitations just by doing MMT. But I can tell you by how bad the Troika crushed them when they went to renegotiate that they might as well have done it. If political change doesn't happen through events alone, it doesn't happen through events alone. There are nevertheless moments which function as a threshold, opening up a new terrain of struggle and allowing different collective emotions to propagate. This is a very elaborate form of the Overton window argument, and the Overton window argument has not done what anyone has said it had done. It has changed the way we talked about politics and the way we post about politics. It has not changed political hope. And if the Anglophone world is where you're looking for this, this is particularly obvious. I mean, I laugh bitterly at this article now. While for the sake of our fragile collective mental health, ouch, we shouldn't get too carried away by the Oxy vote last week. We shouldn't underestimate its significance either. Besides, as Bert Russell argues, the meaning of Oxy is not already guaranteed. No, it wasn't. I agree. It has to be established politically, and it wasn't. The current struggle in Europe currently focuses on Greece, but is sure to spread to much wider in the near future. It didn't. It is an opportunity for us to reclaim democracy after it was captured by neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s. Democracy wasn't captured by neoliberalism. Democracy existed in a capitalist context of which neoliberalism emerged as a way to manage it. It was not a political conspiracy thrust upon you. It was a long project within the sphere of capitalism, but it only became viable when profitability hit. Now, there's a bunch of other things that could have happened. It wasn't the only answer to that, but it was definitely an answer already on the table. And that's why it started under both the labor regime in the 70s in Britain and the Carter administration in the United States a little later, and then was solidified, rationalized, and massively expanded by Thatcher and Reagan. But it didn't begin with them. And even Fisher knows this, hence his timing. The founding moment of neoliberalism was decidedly anti-democratic overthrow of the democratic socialist Allende government in Chile. I mean, you can tell who've been reading Naomi Klein. This was a double defeat. Not only was a democratically elected, non-authoritarian, technologically oriented administration overthrown, an extremely neoliberal government was installed in its place. In Chile, the forced forgetting of the possibility of democratic socialism required mass torture, imprisonment, and repression. This is absolutely true. And yet, how botched the spirit of Chile was going to be by Boric and other people afterwards. Now, Fisher could not have known this in 2015. I sure as fuck didn't know it. But the ironies here are palpable. Because again, this is almost a totally voluntaristic view of politics that ignores its political economic context. Neoliberalism is something enforced upon you from the outside. It's not something that emerges from the system that you already live in. This is a fundamental misrecognition. It is one step away from just being a conspiratorial worldview and not a systemic one. Yet it was dominant on the US left in the mid-aughts. Fisher himself while being right about the symptomaticness of a lot of dour Marxist philosophies and their radical oscillation between volunteerism and hyperdeterminism, when no dialect is there, so to speak. But he misses that perhaps his own position is symptomatic. It's easy to get mad about this now. I wish I could have argued with him. I wish he was still around for us to talk about what this all meant, about how this went so wrong. But anyway, since then, the capitalist counter-revolution called neoliberalism has had a long run of it. Not that long, honestly. About 2 generations at the point of this, at the time of this writing, and it was already beginning to weaken from the right. I mean, we haven't really overcome neoliberalism. We're still using public-private partnerships for everything. But the way that we understood neoliberalism between the 80s and 2007 was already over by the time Fisher was writing this. Even if we still live in a neoliberal regime, it works very differently than the Alan Greenspan monitored Central Bank of the United States and Federal Reserve. But should we start to accept that, even if we can hardly believe it ourselves, that neoliberal capitalism is in its final decadent phase? It's in a decadent phase. We don't know if it's final yet. Remember the end of history? Only a year ago, it seemed like it would last forever. Well, it still did, my friend. Restoration capital reeks of defeat and exhaustion, like the Eastern Bloc at the end of the 1980s. Something we don't talk about anymore because everyone likes systems that they don't know. The Soviet system, just like neoliberal capitalism now, was a gigantic empire of simulation in which by then no one, not even the big other, believed. Okay. I mean, this is this use of Lacanian. Who is the big other who doesn't believe in it? What does this actually mean? These signs got used a lot in this time period, and I don't understand it. Except under state socialism, there was at least social housing, energy supplied by the state, etc. Under late neoliberalism, even in the wealthiest countries, such as ours, well, not anymore, Britain, sorry, we don't even have that. Only a cyber-Gothic Dickensian rerun. Temples of finance living above food banks. 19th century England minus the Victorian capitalist philanthropy and Promethean projects. I mean, this is fair enough. Imagine trying to install a sewer and an underground rail system in neoliberal London now. The whole of the West End feels like a vast construction site and film set. An anxiety dream terrain in which new obstacles appear by the minute. And everything miscontrolled by malfunctioning outsourced AI systems. You have no idea how bad that was going to get, Fisher. Impenetrable and unintelligible, like relics left behind by some long absconded Gnostic demiurge, except that it's new relics that are already malfunctioning and hallucinating all kinds of fun shit. The emotional contagion of the no vote is incalculable. The reality and emotional management system that have served neoliberalism so well are now not only failing, but conspicuously failing. It's funny how so many of them were shored up during the COVID crisis. But again, we can't hold Fisher responsible for not seeing that. He couldn't have. Of course, the buffers, the spoils, and the blockers haven't given up yet. Not here, not in England, the country which was designed the oldest and most effective dampening system the world has ever known. What is it? What is that most effective dampening system? They haven't given up. They haven't even realized that they will soon have to adjust to the reality program they have been peddling, or so long that it has become a drab second nature. Soon they will have to pull the oldest trick in the English bourgeoisie's book. They perfected it in 1688. First of all, you say it is impossible. Then when it happens, you say it is inevitable. You see, we have to preserve the impression that nothing happens, especially when it does. Is that clear? We don't have revolutions here. I mean, they did. But they didn't. So the old capitalist realist script is not to be abandoned. But those still spouting it are increasingly coming off like a donkey-jacked old lefties after Thatcher's victory in '83, bewildered and traumatized, still relying on habits which were once functional, but amount to a kind of madness. A boring madness, of course, it being them. Listen to the BBC, Pravda from Market Stalinism. Roberto Mazzacciodi reprised an interview from Radio 4 in the wake of the Oxy vote. Revealer, I've got no money. Reveler, I've got no money, but if I have money, I wouldn't base my decision on money. Money flows, money evaporates. I have democracy in my heart, and I'm full up. BBC, yes, but will democracy put dinner on the table? You're a young man. Let me tell you as an older man that money matters when you're responsible for a wife and child. I mean, it would be nice to be responsible for a wife and child for most blue-collar Americans today, and I bet you it's even worse in Britain. I haven't looked at those stats. Meanwhile, who Limmy listens to today as John Humphreys is momentarily shell-shocked out of his smirking knowingness. John Humphrey did an excellent impression of a Telegraph comment section contributor secretly kidnapped in his sleep, paradropped into Greece, waking up in Stantagma Square, confused, lonely, and crying out for his wife. Yet the dreary old message, the mantra that the British bourgeoisie recites in its sleep, nothing has ever happened, nothing can ever happen, we need more time, is getting harder to push now that it's evident that the ruling reality structure is coming apart practically everywhere we look. It continues to come apart, and yet nothing is done. We get more and more milquetoast politicians in the Anglophone world, not less, as things come apart, because the complexity of what is coming apart is beyond the scope of almost anyone, including us. Capitalist realism cannot survive when alternatives are flourishing. The alternatives are not only political in the narrow sense, they are also emotional. Codwell Eshun via email, the emotional contagion of the no vote is incalculable, i.e. a different logic of calculation and futurity. The winter years are ending and the summer is coming. No, it was not. The summer was not coming, Mark. The summer was not coming. The summer has not come. If the summer comes, it will not come the way you thought. A hyperstitional spiral. The more we believe it, the more we can make it happen. The more we can make it happen, the more we believe it. Oh, it's so similar to Graeber's voluntarism. And yet also so limited. You underestimated the real power of political economy because you saw yourself as being solely affected by it and not just part of it. This interpolation did not leave you. And I would have said that at the time, and I kind of did. Psychopathologies of corporate capitalism. In its pop, neoliberalism used hope as well as fear. Now, I realize that we're using neoliberalism as a representation of neoliberals, but I do sometimes worry about us constantly attributing intentionality to abstractions like this. As part of the double bind strategy, which battered organized labor while seducing individual workers with the promise of consumer durables, satellite TV, job security, all these riches provided you comply with capital, provided that, as you say, you give it the possibility of Red Plenty. Red Plenty was a book about cybernetics in the early aughts. Since 2010, it has become clear that the flat pack cupboard is bare. There are no more bribes, only threats. There seems to be plenty of bribes, and as long as you're aiming the threats somewhere else, people can get on the jouissance of the threat. Once more, there has been no new thinking, no new strategic orientation from the managers of capital. That was not true. Gorged on decades of easy pickings, true. Capital's meat puppets have let their masters down this time. Their unspoken convention is, if it's broke, it's too much like hard work to fix it. Now, that's still true. We just try to throw AI at it now. They have defaulted to the managerialist equivalent of retromania. More cuts, more accumulation by dispossession, more asset stripping on public services. Well, those all stalled and things have gotten worse. Now, the asset stripping public services still go on in Britain, but that's because they really do have real limitations right now. This program has to be understood in the libidinal as well as political economic terms. It would be better if you just stuck to political economic terms, Mark. Because there is no economy without politics, no economy without libido. I mean, that's true, but also doesn't say as much as it seems to say. It makes it seem like the economy is about the individual desire, the individual libido, but the economy is about the relational complexes that emerge from those individual desires. The individual desire is not and cannot ever be the economic relation. It is only part of it, is only a motivating factor of part of it. And in aggregate, it explains very little. It is a psychopathology of the corporate elite, sure. Even if the ultimate libido driving capita is miser masochism, it is not. We saw plenty of non-miserliness in venture capital from the 20 teens. I will let myself become the means by which capital grows and proliferates. It is clear that capital, which can machine whatever desiring complexes it needs, again, I wish we were more clear about what was doing the machining here, has from the start called upon the ancient Gothic impulse towards humiliating and subjugating others. Well, I mean, yes, because it's about power, and power is always power over others. I mean, very few projects, Marxism, anarchism, a few other radical leftisms, have actually said that part of the goal would be the end of subjugation of others. Yeah. Neoliberalism is not unique in that. That is not anything that makes neoliberalism unique. It doesn't even make capitalism unique. As is said by Mark here. I mean, to be fair, he's implying it by the Gothic, right? The medieval. Neoliberalism is in trouble now because, decoupled from any positive inducement, these drives, whatever exempted by the Troika and the deadly loan shark theater it is playing out with Greece people's lives, are the IDS, visibly excited by the prospects of hurting the poor, are now appearing more and more exposed form. Here's the problem. Just because something is more and more exposed in a sadism does not mean that you're going to defeat it. A lot of people, particularly not in the Europe, have known that this was sadistic all along. Neoliberal austerity is at once a form of sadism in the technical psychoanalytic sense rather than the everyday moralizing sense in corporate anorexia. I really wish Fisher would have been more responsible in employing psychological metaphors. I wish that about all leftism, and I think we're finally fucking moving away from that, but it's been a long, hard road home. What sadism and anorexia have in common is a belief in the indestructibility of the phantasmic body. No matter how much I cut, no matter how much I puzzle, the body will survive. In the sadist case, the phantasmic body is the body of the endlessly humiliated other. No, sadists are aware that they can kill their masochists. In the anorestic case, the phantasmic body is, in a sense, their own. Not in a sense, it is literally their own. Yet the infinite elasticity of the fantastic body eventually comes up against the limits of the physical body. Anorexia is the only mental illness that can directly kill you, but anorexics don't want to die. They are engaged in an indefinite process of becoming thinner, which death actually interrupts. I actually do not know that I think anorexia is the only mental illness that can directly kill you. Bulimia can do it. Alcoholism can do it. I can go on. Addiction in general can do it. This is actually like irresponsible on a variety of levels. It's important to see how the capitalist fantasy necessarily oscillates between a punishing without end of the objective phantasmic body, where the worker can be endlessly punished, restructured, and or eliminated, cut. The layering of metaphors here that seem to clarify what, but are actually obscuring, is a little bit a lot. A belated recognition that the phantasmic body depends on the actual physically precarious body with vulnerabilities and real limits. Any sadist knows that. You could say that capital as such cannot recognize the collective worker body as belonging to it. Only communism can perform this integration. Yeah, but we've already said you can't coexist with both, and you've said we should, Mark. The ultimate fantasy here, the ultimate fantasy of capital itself, is cutting workers away altogether. I mean, that would make it hard for them to make money if everything is fixed capital. Capital's libidinal metaphysics is a kind of cosmic libertarianism. Capital identifies itself as a force unbounded by energy whose capacity for infinite accumulation is obstructed only by political contingencies. Soon, always soon, capital dreams, I will be free of the need for politics and free of the need for humans too. I mean, to be fair to Fisher, this is what Nick Land was arguing around this time, so maybe this is what he's responding to. I liquidate liberal, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. Capital realizes utopia would be a burned out planet full of fully automated factories turning out shit that no one wants to buy, with no one left to buy it anyway, because the conditions for the continued existence of these factories is the destruction of the environments human can live in. I don't know if that's capital's realized utopia so much as the end result, but whatever. A great deal of modern economic discourse takes as its axiomatic that the economic forces are the only ones that matter. This idea has bled into politics too, at least in the Western world, not just in the Western world. Economic forces have been awarded the status of inexorable truths. The scenario we're given, the one being made to feel inevitable, is that of hyper-capitalist dystopia. That's capital doing better than ever, the robots doing all the work, the great masses of humanity not doing much but having fun playing with gadgets. I mean, it would help if there was more understanding of political economy in this text and left libidinal free association both in the text itself and in what Fisher is citing. If there's no work, there's going to be questions about who can afford to buy the gadgets, John Lancaster. The absence of abundance is already accepted. The metaphors of the nature poets mapping human hearts through once commonly understood imagery are irrelevant and impenetrable. The sun of winter, the moon of summer, and the singing birds, except the missile thrush that loves juniper, are all shut out. I'm sorry, missile what? Can the juniper be monetized? Is this missile thing for sale? Our children already have no stable baseline in which to collaborate the loss of all that lives. It's game over. Bearing this in mind, I finally find myself reluctantly agreeing with the business community. There is no time for delay. Let's build the one way. Let's choke the earth. Let's get this damn thing over with. For what can be avoided, whose end is proposed by the mighty gods of business. Hastening our demise. Let our children be the last of their sorry line. I mean, Zoomers and Gen Alpha very much feel that way. And spare their unborn descendants any further suffering. We will not save the rhino. We will not even save the hedgehog. How can we save the world? But if you can purge cheap sentiment from your mind, how exciting and fascinating it will be to watch as the world becomes uninhabitable. It's going to be worth going on a health kick to survive another 60 years and see everything immobilated. How many humans have the awe-inspiring opportunity to witness such spectacle? The end of all that is. I mean, if you were only so lucky that an apocalypse is that clear, my friend. Why not export capital and its willing servants, if they are keen on it, to an already dead planet? I mean, that would be kind of fun. Then capital can get on realizing it's utopia, and we can get on recovering there for red plenty. Again, you could tell what Fisher was reading at the time. Ultron pictures, yay. It is crucial to note that capital here doesn't and necessarily cannot understand itself. I mean, it's an abstraction. Of course, it can't understand itself. Capital is like a neuromancer before the fated fusion with the winter mute, a component part which narcissistically mistakes itself for the final cause. Or it is like Ultron, a deranged personification of a worldwide network, part fiendish artificial intelligence, part artificial stupidity, part petulant infant, constitutively blinded by its own core programming. The layers of metaphor pop cultures here are fascinating, and this was something I found interesting in Fisher, and probably why he was so well read, but it was also problematic because it actually takes the images we produce about ourselves as somehow telling about ourselves in some primary way and not in an indirect way. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I should give Fisher more credit on these, but I find this to be still not dealing with a lot of what's at hand. It's a lot of moving the scope around so we can talk about democracy as joy and capitalism as a necromancer, which, that isn't unique to Fisher. Marx talks about capital in monstrous terms. I mean, you go read Das Kapital, you see it. But what I'm not getting here is he started off by attacking Maoists and other Leninists for our insistence that this democratic fusion in a capitalist society won't be good enough. And is also treating capital as a thing external to that society, not internal to it. And it's a weird thing to think about if you actually think through it like consistently at all. Personification of things within the discourse of capital presents the personification of things within capitalism. That is, the fetishism of commodities. But in addition to these two registers of personification, there remains another two, which Marx's preface calls attention to: the personification of persons, both textually and systemically. Capital personifies persons, so capital personifies persons. The individual whom the bourgeois economics takes as an economic agent are treated in the text as personifications of social relations whose creature they remain. First and foremost, these categories is capital itself, and thus seldom is there reference to the capitalist without a clarifying clause, i.e. capital personified. When persons are personified, they are made into the image and likeness of an person, capital. Bet this is Jameson. Capital is the subject in this world. All other actors are figures, masks, faces, prosopoetic personifications of the subject. This is the primacy of capital already emblazoned in the title Capital. The places 19th century novels most reserved for their subject. Capital is the subject of capital, as David Copperfield or Jane Eyre or Daniel Deronda are subjects of David Copperfield, Jane Eyre, and Daniel Deronda. The analytic importance of the subject position, an idea advanced by the trope of personification more than by its exposition, is not only that capital is a protagonist of modernity, but that the workings of capitalism are described by their subjectification and embodiment of an abstraction. Capital is the story of capital's becoming subject, of the relentless self-construction and valorization of value that propels this mode of production. The artifice of the, not actual Jameson, it's Anna Kornbluth. Okay. A valorization of value that propels this mode of production. The artifice of this trope of personification calls attention to the artifice and instability of the subject, to the fissures and crises of the course of becoming, in its adventures of the Bildung. I find this really interesting because this kind of pessimism that Fisher is rejecting, he's also citing seemingly positively. All right, and then we have, for those of you who can't wait, we have a classic image of a Marvel comic. We'll just read it. There's a top box. Angrily, a voice from the screen lashes back at the questioners as a gloved hand reaches out. You have no rights as long as you are my hirelings, because I desire the Avengers to know who engineered their dismal defeat. I shall reveal the true nature of him who commands you carried out. The Crimson Cow, who gave us all the orders, was a robot. That must be why he stayed seated all the time. Then who was the real cowl? The one who just unmasked the robot. Insofar that we are programmed by capital, we can't understand what capital is either. Sure. I mean, this is an Adornian point, ironically. The conditions for understanding capital properly lie outside of it in the communist science that, to hijack a phrase from Nick Land, must create the conditions from its own emergence almost entirely out of its enemy's resources. From the inside of capital is an economic system which relies on politics only contingently. Actually, it relies on politics pretty purely, but it wants you to think it relies on it only contingently, so fair point. From the outside, capital is an intricate set of libidinal, ideological, violent mechanisms designed to block the emergence of red plenty. I don't think it was designed to block the emergence of red plenty at all. It was designed to valorize its fucking self. That happens to block the emergence of red plenty. By that you mean communism, I guess. There is no economy. Oh, God. Philosophical interlude. Skip to the next session if you want to avoid. There is no economy. There is no pure economy, no economy without politics, no economy without libido. Okay. There is no economy where the steaming separation between the civil and the political is actually a real separation. That's true. That is different from saying there is no economy. David Graeber is surely right that neoliberal. I love when people say surely right because it's a way of not making an argument. It's a way of asserting an argument and letting you not notice that it was just an assertion. But go ahead. David Graeber is surely right that neoliberalism is a form of capitalism that systemically prioritizes political imperatives over economic ones. Given the choice between a course of action that would make capitalism seem only possible economic system and one that would transform capitalism to a viable long-term economic system, neoliberalism chooses the former every time. What does that mean? There's every reason to believe that the job-destroying security while increasing working hours does not create a more productive, let alone more innovative or loyal workforce. I mean, that's true. We've seen that. We've seen actual evidence for that. Probably in economic terms, the result is negative, an impression confirmed by the lower growth rates in just about all parts of the world in the 80s and 90s, with the exception now of India. We've seen lower growth rates in China, but they're still way higher in China than the West, although that's a problem for complicated reasons. But the neoliberal choice has been effectively in depoliticizing labor and overdetermining the future. Economically, the growth of armies, police, and private security services amount to dead weight. It's possible, in fact, that the very dead weight of the apparatus created to ensure the ideological victory of capitalism will sink it. But it is also easy to see how choking off any sense of the inevitable redemptive future that could be different from our world is a crucial part of the neoliberal project. What I'm so fascinated about Graeber is an anarchist, right? He believes in radically decentering, that the Occupy was enough, that this was a way out of capitalism. And yet, Graeber's advice almost always leads to very reformist politics with very radical language. And honestly, what neoliberalism is using government force to compel equal into markets that are public-private partnerships where private people benefit without actually even the profit motives that you see in entrepreneurial capitalism. In other words, neoliberalism is a grand rethinking mechanism. It's an extension of monopoly capital, and the ideological effect of the laissez-faire is to get you to buy into it because it seems like you are free, but you're being compelled to enter markets where you are now subject to a middleman that you have no control over, interfacing between you and the government. That's not a pure capitalist economy in the entrepreneurial 19th century sense. It is something akin to a mask put on by managerial monopoly capital, which itself we can describe as either Fordism or social democracy, depending on the level of government involvement. However, we just have to admit that it still functions like capital. This isn't like a fundamental change in the way capitalism works. It still works by the MCM prime mechanism. And thus, monopoly capital as a finer form of capital that resolves the contradictions of capitalism isn't true. It emerges again, and you need to repaint it and remanage it, which is what neoliberalism really is. Whether or not it does these other more abstract things, I think in a lot of cases it does. That isn't what it essentially is. That's how it essentially manifests. Those are differences. All right. From the start, economy was the object cause of the bourgeois science, whose hyperstitionally bootstrapped self into existence and then built and melted the matter of this and every other world to fit its presumptions. The greatest theocratic achievement in history that was never human, an immense conjuring trick which worked all the better because it came shrouded in the damp gray of English and Scottish empiricism, which claimed to have seen off all gods. Man, this rhetoric gets old. And man, does Fisher like rhetoric. When Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, she was only echoing the assumptions of Human Smith. Whoa, that's wrong. That's just wrong. I actually have no idea how you could read Human Smith and say that. Society is an unsupportable abstraction, a spook that proper scientific thinking will exercise soon enough. That is not what Smith thought. That isn't even what Hume thought. Only impressions are variable. Everything else is superstitious junk to be jettisoned. That everything that is except capital, those bloody savages attribute power to their wooden gods, whereas Hume, to his credit, at least pushed empiricism to the point where it dismantled itself. It turned out, Hume showed, that when pursued to its logical conclusions, empiricism leads us when none of the presumptions upon which the emergent secular liberalism relied. I mean, that's true. That's what caused, that's in some ways what inspired German idealism to exist. There is no self. There is no impression with the current response of what we call self, a double scandal for empiricism, since all ideas were supposed to be rooted in impressions, the sentiments. Here, Fisher is closer to correct than in that last overstating paragraph. Just as there is no causality, we don't experience cause and effect, only constant conjunction. Well, actually, Hume doesn't say there's no causality. He says we can't know that there's any causality, which is different. But I guess effectively, as far as the human subject, it's the same. Hume, stung by the spider skepticism, offered a kind of homeopathic remedy against reason's tendency to evacuate the human world of all its fetishes, touchstones, and commonplaces. Reason, Hume argued, slumping into his backgammon chair, only has a very limited dominion over our lives. Emotion and habit dictate most of what we think and do, the beginning of emotivism. Thus, the self and causality are back, and Kant's transcendental critique arrives to clear up the mess. All right, this paragraph is pretty accurate. Sarcasm aside. This other paragraph, less so. So there is no escaping libido, not even for the British. This insight is crucial to the radical enlightenment. I'm guessing he's referring to let's see. Is he referring to who I think he's referring to? I'm just going to check. Oh, it's not found. The radical enlightenment, but this is Spinoza, where Spinoza patiently prepared his lens grinder's lab in Amsterdam. As defenders of the theocratic and secular power quickly realized, radical enlightenment was the most dangerous weapon in Christendom. And we're already kind of past Christendom at this point. Not least because it exposed as bogus the very difference between theocratic and secular power. There is in all political power an irreducible theocratic element. Go ahead. Spinoza preemptively takes out both British imperialism and continental trajectory kicked off by Kant. The greatest trick German idealism ever pulled was pretending that Spinoza never existed. I mean, this is Althusserianism light, except I'm not sure what this actually means. The critique of superstition is meaningless while we still believe in free will and the self. The first anthropomorphic act is the invention of the human being projected back upon the image of the invented God who does not only exist, but couldn't possibly exist. Even God couldn't have free will. Okay, but how does this help your voluntaristic politics, Fisher? I am lost here. You seem to have lost your own plot about democracy and joy. For human beings who want to move in the direction of love and freedom, I mean, how could they want to move anything? Because we have no will to move it. I mean, if we take Spinoza's determinism to its logical conclusion, it's not just that we don't have counter-causal free will, we're utterly determined like clockwork, which is implied in Spinoza, by the way. The only thing that helps it is the Lucretian Epicurean swerve, which continuously minks upon change, which is what got Althusser on a hang-up in a tizzy as well. The only option consists in the apparent paradox of the theoretical practically inserting itself into the naturalistic matrix of cause and effect. The effect is to break down the cordon sanitaire that Hume placed around emotions, preserving bourgeois thought's common sense division between feelings and thought. In refuting its opposition, radical enlightenment democratizes the possibility of what Lynn Siegel calls radical happiness, with the proviso that Spinoza preferred to think of joy rather than happiness because he associates happiness with happenstance. That's a bad reading of Spinoza. Emotions don't just happen, they emerge out of fields of cause and effect, which can be analyzed. Sure. This means feelings can be engineered in the hyperstational spiral, which has more to do with what Justin Barton calls lucidity than what academic philosophers call reason. I'm using the term emotion rather than effect here very deliberately. Effect that is now routinely used by academics is pretty much completely opposed to what Spinoza meant by it. I mean, I would love for you to cite what Spinoza meant by it instead of just asserting it. The problem begins with Deleuze. Oh, fuck. And with the fatal splicing out of Spinoza's project of emotional engineering with Bergson's vitalist cult of creativity and unpredictability. I mean, it does actually. There was a vitalist cult there. It is hard to think of thinkers more opposed in their fundamental presumptions and orientations than Spinoza and Bergson. Yeah, I agree with that. And more or less everything is wrong with Deleuze, in my view, is tied up with his infatuation with Bergson. It is Bergsonism, rather than Spinozism, which is the true ideology of capitalism. Huh? It is true that the many key sciences of late capitalism, libidinal and reality engineering, advertising, brand and media, and the happiness industry are in some sense Spinozic. I mean, sure, and that they deny human agency. But this has captured Spinozism and emotional engineering tethered to capital's needs, not geared to its production of joy. I don't understand how Spinoza's determinism gets you to the production of joy, and I don't think Fisher has made an argument that clarifies that at all. It does not move or change or grow old. It remains forever icily silent. Sorry for the inconvenience on picture and screen. The idea that a wave of economic change is so disruptive to the social order that society might rebel against it, that has, it seems, disappeared from the realm of the possible. But its disappearance of the 47% of jobs in 2 decades, as per Frey and Osborne, must be right on the edge of what society can bear, not so much of that 47% as because of the time frame. Jobs do go away. It happens many times. For jobs to go away with that speed, however, is a new thing, and the search for historical precedents with examples from which we can learn won't take us far. How would the speed out of job disappearance combined with extensive deflation play out? We don't have extensive deflation. The truth is, nobody knows. In the absence of any template or precedent, the idea of economic process will just roll ahead like a juggernaut unopposed by any social political counterforces is a stretch. The robots will only eat all the jobs if we decide to let them. John Lancaster. Well, there's other reasons why they won't eat all the jobs. Is that they're fixed capital. Jesus Christ, if you're going to cite Mark, actually read him. The last reflective capitalist managers believe their own propaganda. The welfare state was a regrettable moral lapse and indulgence. The thought that it has an insurance policy against revolution doesn't really compute anymore. Why worry about revolution now? Well, why indeed? Not like we've done anything. Reality is now real more than it ever was, established as a kind of granite and an inertial certainty from which the possibility of change is a priori excluded. But beneath the fringy simulation of productivity, a sterile no man's land, which does not move, which remains forever icy and silent, the more intelligent of capital's agents, however, must realize that this cannot continue for much longer. Neoliberalism is a smash and grab raid, a last hurrah before the helicopter off of a compound, let everything else descend into an Oryx and Crake style dystopia. Man, I do like, I gotta say, I love Fisher as a writer. He's an incredibly evocative writer, but once you move a lot of these invocations away and try to actually get beyond the stacking of metaphors and fragments here, one wonders if you're left with anything more than an Adam Curtis documentary, which gives you the appearance of having made an argument out of a bunch of stock footage from the BBC. But when you actually add up the components of said argument, you realize not one was actually made. And was weirdly copacetic with the status quo, besides seeming to critique it. I'm not sure that we can accuse Fisher of that, except Fisher has foregone the most radical of politics in the beginning of this as really saying nothing can happen. But what does he put forward? He's put forward Syriza Podemos. He's put forward the Mufa Macau left populism in the electoral sphere, which went down like a Led Zeppelin. All right. Anyway. Up here again in the Kingdom of Gormenghast, that's a book, you should look it up, where everything covers in crooks, shadows cast by twisting towers and turrets of finance capital. We're already living in dystopia, but a dystopia that cloaks itself in the time-honored manner of the English bourgeoisie, the boring. Yeah, well, it's going to be a lot less boring soon, brother man. Hyper-anxiety digitally glossed over the high-res distraction machines made for a wonderful capture system. Deep in the bowels of Middle England, bunkered far away from all the hashtags, handheld devices, and other harangues technologies they distribute amongst the lower orders. There are a lot more than amongst the lower orders. In fact, it took the lower orders a little bit of time to get to them. These eminences are grease about what's close to celebrating total victory, the finer achievement of their historic mission. Close, but no Cuban cigar. If only it hadn't been for those pesky Greeks and those Spaniards and those Scots, those bloody foreigners don't know what's good for them. I mean, it was really the Germans who were doing that. The English bourgeoisie kind of cut the game, but whatever. The English bourgeoisie, crushing spirits and making everything boring since 1750. If there's a sentient creature anywhere in the cosmos that is not boring and miserable, they will find it and neutralize it. I mean, Anglo brain shit. We have vampires. All vampires are the first of all vampirized, and look at the long faces and manicured gray fingers of these ghouls. I mean, there's a long history of portraying capitals as vampires going back to, I don't know, all kinds of things, including the first vampire novels, which were also either about capitalists or aristocrats. Capitalists' oldest and most trusted servants see what capital does to human resources. Long gone are the virile, predatory vampires that once populated horror stories about capitalism, sucking out the vital essence of the proletarian and Gothic fortresses of dead labor. Instead, shambling, worm-eating wrecks mill about aimlessly while augmenting their numbers in obscure cannibalistic circuits that defy rational comprehension and which are, in any case, too hideous to steadily contemplate. Fiends have degenerated into ghouls, which not hunt and feed to strengthen themselves, but only carry on, prolong their putrescent decrepitude. Nick Land. And what Nick Land are we citing here? Oh, from Suspended Animation. This is, I don't know. This is right-wing Nick Land. All right. Those gray Anglo-Saxon Protestant capitalist sorcerers have an appeal in light. They pay their subordinates well, all those CEOs, politicians, and colonists. To spend the line that England in 2015, possibly the most oppressed country ever to exist on Earth, is some shining island of freedom and wealth that immigrants are desperate to get into. I mean, they were when you were leveraging a very weird agreement with the EU that made going to England a way to get pay that outshined the euro. Which was only done because of weird finance arrangements, but that's all over now, and that definitely isn't happening now. Only in secret do they boast of capital's other subterranean agents and English chief export product is a historical defeat of the working class. What if English chief export product supposedly is finance, which is not a product? To some degree, it's a lieutenant to America's empire, but that's limited. We have a real estate bubble on the basis of the finance system, which is bursting. Although, I mean, not really. The finance system is bursting, not the real estate bubble, ironically. Because every super rich person in the entire world has had to have a house in London. So they're selling bits of London and the Southeast. Why is it appealing? On one hand, you get a creative, subservient working class. You get the best servants here. Second of all, it's security. You have political safety. Whereas if you come from Bahrain, Singapore, and Macau, and these places where something could still happen. David Graeber. Democracy is joy. Neoliberalism has reached a point where it's now forced to undermine its own libidinal and ideological basis. The Troika's naked attempt to unseat Syriza are unpicking the naturalized associations of capitalism with democracy, which capitalist realism has depended. In the final phase, capitalist realism cannot even muster the pretense. Can Fisher write without a hypostatization? I really want this for real. Anyway. In this final phase, capitalist realism cannot even muster the pretense that it can't even tolerate democracy, still less that capitalism is the only political system compatible with democracy. Apparently, the Greek referendum was polarizing, was it? When 60% voted no and no single area voted otherwise, it seems likely to be unifying than polarizing. Perhaps that's the problem. It turns out consistency is not what you thought it was. Well, yeah, the thing is, no one really actually wants democracy. They all say they do. In the capitalist world. But they don't. Remember that Manistonian protection for minorities was about protecting the rich. Any question which that's for a yes or no is sort of likely to be polarizing anyway, isn't it? Polarizing the most repeated uses means that the masses of people have been asked to consider fundamental issues to their lives. These are difficult questions. It would be better if they didn't task themselves with them and can't understand them anyway. So polarizing equals likely to cause thought, debate, dispute, and subject them to the stresses of political agency. How dare government go to the people with such a pressing and complex questions, when its job is to shield them from the difficult of thought via technocracy? Polarizing here just means profound questions that touch and demand action on the fundamental aspects of social organization. You got outflanked by the right on all these questions, didn't you? But to be asked such questions and to debate or dispute them isn't vexing, harrowing, or painful. It's essential and welcome. Political agency is not a burden. I mean, how is political agency not a burden when you barely believe in agency via Spinozic logic? This argument actually seems really confused. But it's so well written that it's hard to notice that it's really confused. It's the absence which weighs upon you and its apparent demands that are experienced instead as euphoria, a lightening of the load, a lifting up. The powerful affective elements of mass production and something Jeremy Gilbert gets at well in common ground, and the hunger and need for those kinds of intensities is palpable. In his speech before the vote last night, Tsipras observed before he stabbed Varoufakis in the back, at least so the translation ran, democracy is joy. So fucking better. You know, to have democracy is joy and vote by Kamala Harris indirectly, when we see Tsipras and what he did with that, it's very better. Fisher could have known that, but man, has history not looked kindly on this essay and this line of thinking. Now to capitalist realism's useful idiots line up on Twitter. Dan Hodges. Well, just held a referendum on myself, and I've been voted overwhelmingly not to pay off my credit bill or mortgage this month. Simon Skimma. I'm voting no to my credit card bill today. This will put me in a much stronger position to negotiate a repayment schedule. I'm voting no to facile folk economic bullshit. I am too. I'm with you on this. But, I'm voting no to bank bailouts and bankers' bonuses paid out of public money. I would love for that had been stopped, but it wasn't. In fact, it's only gotten worse. See how much of this happened during COVID. It was massive, and the political right made more hay of it than the political left did. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't give it. The political right's also a lot of the people who enabled shit like PPP loans, but those who giveth to elites also complaineth about said elites. Just like we talk about PMC on PMC violence here in Bar Blog. The category isn't will, except for the people who are in it complaining about other people who are in it. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. Then so did the divine right of kings. Now, this was put on my in-show by someone else, and I actually fundamentally reject it because the divine right of kings was not really believed that well. And this is an Ursula K. Le Guin's soul story. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. No, it doesn't. And so did the divine line of kings. No, it didn't. If the divine line of kings was so uncontestable, the War of the Roses wouldn't have fucking happened. Manchester. Chester. All right. There's a possible alternative, however, in which ownership and control of robots is disconnected from capital in its current form. Oh, yay. Space communism. The robots liberate most of humanity from work, except that you don't. You got to keep up the war box. And everyone benefits from the proceeds. No, it doesn't. Robots require fucking energy, and you got to produce that. We don't have the work in the factories or go down to the mines or clean turrets or drive long-distance lorries, but we can choreograph and weave and garden and tell stories and invent things and set about creating a new universe of wants. This would be the world of unlimited wants described by economics, but with a distinction between the wants satisfied by humans and the work done by our machines. It seems to me that the only way such a world would work is the alternative forms of ownership. The only reason for thinking a better world is possible is the dystopian future of capitalism plus robots must prove just too grim to be politically viable. So far, not true. It just seems that robots are very stupid. This alternative future would be the kind of world dreamed up by William Morris, humans engaged in meaningful, insanely remunerated labor, except with added robots. I mean, that would be a good vision. I'm not disagreeing with this vision. I just think it's overly optimistic, even for a socialist future. It says a lot about the current moment as we stand, facing a future which might resemble either a hyper-capitalist utopia or a socialist paradise. The second option doesn't get a mention. It got plenty of a fucking mention. The second half of the last decade was people mentioning it all the goddamn time and then betraying it over and over and over again. Plenty of people mentioned it. It was a smoke screen. And we have this comic. I mean, I gotta give Fisher power of his visual reference, man. I mean, the guy does know how to build a non-argument. For if they somehow remained intact, we would be in deadly danger. Epilogue. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, and from the wrinkled lip and sneer a cold command. This is a sculptor will those passions read, would which yet survive, stamped of these lifeless things, and at the hand that mocked them, the heart that fed, and the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look at my work in ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stress far away. Which is a Shelley poem, but put in a Avengers comic. And then we have a picture of a robot hugging a human. Comments are closed, except for mine. This may seem to be a mean reading, but I want to point out that I don't actually understand from this what he meant by democracy is joy. But I can tell you that what he saw this joy coming from didn't go the way he hoped. Neoliberalism may be ending, but capitalism doesn't seem to be weakening. We all keep hoping it is. But I don't. We'd have to make it so, and no one agrees on how to do that. And increasingly, a lot of the people who think they're fighting capitalism want to spare it elsewhere. They're just, quote, anti-imperialist, unquote, ignoring, of course, that capital within a closed system will always have to expand. And how will it do that? Trade leverage or outright colonialism? Yeah. You should think about that more. I've been harsh to Fisher because this represents to me a very convoluted turn of thought. But one of someone who's clearly brilliant. I mean, man, the man could write. Write so well you can barely notice that you don't understand his argument and that he didn't cite everything. And then what he did cite, didn't, sometimes furthered his argument and sometimes didn't. What do we make of that? I don't know, but I can tell you democracy is not joy. From the standpoint of a few days before the election in 2024, anyone saying democracy is joy has quoted Cyprus before he even betrayed Varoufakis, and we all know how Syriza all went. We have the dismal vision of hindsight. Have not come to praise Fisher, but to bury him. But in that, there is a little bit of praise. He wanted to see past the seeming nihilism of the 90s and aughts, see to a socialist future. At a time when he started in the late aughts, it seemed very, very far away. And then by 2016, we all convinced ourselves it was nearly imminent, but it wasn't. Now what do we do? It's easy to hate on Fisher for being wrong. It's harder to say, despite all that, his vision was on to something. But he couldn't do it. Can we pick up the pieces for him? And if not, are we any better? That's a question, and that's a challenge. Protect your peace, like and subscribe. Make of this what you will. Take care. And pour one out for Fisher. The world is a lot sadder without him.